Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez never imagined that her routine convoy escort mission through the dusty streets of Fallujah would become a fight for her life. The 28-year-old communications specialist from San Antonio, Texas, had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months, serving with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. She was known among her unit for her quick thinking, steady nerves, and infectious laugh that could lighten even the darkest moments in the war zone. The morning of November 15, 2004, started like any other. Rodriguez checked her equipment twice, ensuring her radio gear was functioning perfectly. The convoy consisted of 4 Humvees carrying supplies to a forward operating base on the outskirts of Fallujah. Intelligence reports indicated the route was relatively secure, though everyone knew that in this city, safety was always an illusion. Rodriguez sat in the passenger seat of the third vehicle, her eyes scanning the narrow streets lined with concrete barriers and abandoned buildings. The locals had mostly evacuated as military operations intensified in the area. Windows stared down at them like empty eye sockets, and the silence felt heavy with unseen threats. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the world exploded around them. The lead vehicle hit an improvised explosive device buried beneath a pile of debris. The blast sent chunks of concrete and metal flying through the air like deadly confetti. Before Rodriguez could process what had happened, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The convoy had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush. Insurgents positioned in buildings on both sides of the street opened fire with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. The second Humvee took a direct hit from an RPG, its armored hull buckling under the impact. Rodriguez watched in horror as her fellow soldiers fought desperately to return fire while trying to find cover. Her driver, Corporal Jake Thompson, was hit in the first volley of gunfire. Blood splattered across the windshield as he slumped forward, his foot sliding off the accelerator. Rodriguez grabbed the steering wheel, trying to keep their vehicle from crashing into a concrete barrier, while enemy bullets shattered the windows around them. The radio crackled with desperate voices calling for backup, medical evacuation, and air support. Rodriguez knew she had to get their position to headquarters, but first she had to survive the next few minutes. She pulled Thompson's unconscious body away from the pedals and slid into the driver's seat, her heart pounding as bullets continued to pepper their vehicle. The ambush was unlike anything Rodriguez had experienced. The insurgents had studied their patrol routes and chosen this location perfectly. The narrow street offered no escape routes, and the elevated positions in surrounding buildings gave the attackers every advantage. It was a killing field designed to eliminate an entire convoy. Rodriguez floored the accelerator, trying to ram their way through the debris blocking the street. Behind her, she could hear Specialist Amy Chen returning fire through the rear window, her M4 rifle chattering as she tried to suppress the enemy positions. The smell of gunpowder and diesel fuel filled the air, mixed with the metallic taste of fear. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed past their windshield, missing by inches before exploding against a building wall. Chunks of concrete rained down on their vehicle as Rodriguez fought to maintain control. She could see muzzle flashes coming from at least 6 different positions, and more insurgents were moving to cut off any possible retreat. The radio in her lap sparked and went silent as a bullet found its mark. Their communication link to headquarters was severed. They were alone in the middle of a coordinated attack with no way to call for help. Rodriguez realized that survival now depended entirely on their ability to fight their way out or find a defensible position until rescue arrived, but rescue seemed impossibly far away as the gunfire intensified, and more insurgents appeared in the windows above them. The ambush was working exactly as planned, and Rodriguez knew that in the next few minutes, she would either find a way to save her team or they would all become casualties in the bloody battle for Fallujah. The sound of her own weapon joined the chaos as she prepared to make the most important decisions of her life. Every choice in the next few seconds would determine whether she lived to see another day or became another name on the memorial wall back home. Rodriguez yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending their damaged Humvee crashing through a chain-link fence into what appeared to be an abandoned courtyard. The vehicle's engine coughed and died, steam rising from bullet holes in the radiator. They were trapped, but at least the surrounding walls provided some protection from the crossfire that had turned the street into a death zone. Specialist Chen was already dragging the unconscious Corporal Thompson from the driver's sighed when Rodriguez heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar fire. She tackled both soldiers to the ground just as the first shell exploded 20 yards away, sending a shower of dirt and debris over their position. The insurgents were adjusting their fire, walking the mortars closer to their hiding spot. Blood ran down Rodriguez's left arm where shrapnel had torn through her uniform, but she ignored the pain. Her training kicked in as she assessed their situation. Thompson was breathing but unconscious, with a head wound that needed immediate attention. Chen had taken a bullet through her shoulder but was still able to fight. Their ammunition was limited, their radio was destroyed, and enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. The courtyard offered temporary shelter, but Rodriguez knew it would soon become their tomb if they stayed put. Through gaps in the concrete wall, she could see insurgents moving through the building across the street, preparing for another assault. The sound of boots on gravel told her that others were approaching their position from the rear alley. Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She told Chen to stay with Thompson and defend their position, while she attempted to reach the radio in one of the other convoy vehicles. It was a desperate plan that required her to cross 50 yards of open ground under enemy fire. But without communication, they had no hope of rescue. The moment she left the courtyard's protection, the world became a nightmare of flying bullets and explosions. Rodriguez sprinted toward the overturned second Humvee, zigzagging between pieces of debris while automatic weapons fire chased her across the exposed ground. She could hear the angry buzz of bullets passing inches from her head as she dove behind the wreckage. The vehicle's radio was intact but pinned beneath twisted metal. Rodriguez worked frantically to free the equipment while bullets sparked off the armored hull above her. She could hear Chen's rifle firing steadily from the courtyard, buying her precious seconds to complete her mission. Every moment counted as the sound of enemy voices grew closer. Finally, the radio came free. Rodriguez quickly tuned to the emergency frequency and began transmitting their position and status. Her voice was calm despite the chaos around her as she provided coordinates and requested immediate air support and medical evacuation. The response came through crackling static confirming that help was on the way, but it would take time to reach them. As Rodriguez prepared to make the dangerous journey back to her team, an RPG slammed into the ground nearby. The explosion lifted her off her feet and sent her tumbling behind a concrete barrier. When the ringing in her ears subsided, she realized she could no longer hear Chen's rifle firing from the courtyard. A cold fear gripped her heart as she contemplated what that silence might mean. The insurgents had used the distraction of the explosion to advance their positions. Rodriguez could see armed figures moving through the smoke, searching for survivors among the convoy wreckage. She was cut off from her team with no way to know if they were still alive. The radio crackled with updates from headquarters, but the promised air support was still 15 minutes away. Rodriguez checked her remaining ammunition and found only 2 magazines left. The weight of command settled heavily on her shoulders as she realized that the decision she made in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the survival of her entire team. The enemy was closing in, and she was running out of time and options. A new sound reached her ears through the gunfire and explosions. Voices calling in Arabic, coordinating their final assault on the courtyard where Chen and Thompson were hiding. Rodriguez knew that her teammates were about to be overrun, and she was the only thing standing between them and certain death. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and prepared to charge back into the nightmare. Whatever happened next, she would not abandon her soldiers. Even if it meant facing impossible odds, she would fight until her last breath to bring them home alive. Rodriguez burst from her cover behind the concrete barrier, firing as she ran toward the courtyard where her team was trapped. The insurgents had anticipated this move and were waiting for her. The first bullet caught her in the right thigh, spinning her around but not stopping her advance. She kept moving, determined to reach Chen and Thompson before the enemy overran their position. The second and third bullets hit her torso, punching through her body armor at close range. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but Rodriguez continued firing her weapon, even as she stumbled forward. She could see muzzle flashes coming from the courtyard, entrance where insurgents were preparing to finish off her wounded teammates. Rodriguez threw herself through the gap in the fence, just as a burst of automatic weapons fire tore through the space where she had been standing. The fourth, fifth, and sixth bullets found their mark as she rolled across the courtyard, each impact sending shockwaves of pain through her body. Blood was flowing freely from multiple wounds, but her focus remained razor-sharp on protecting her soldiers. Chen was slumped against the courtyard wall, her weapon silent, blood pooling beneath her motionless form. Thompson remained unconscious but breathing, somehow protected by the Humvee's bulk from the worst of the gunfire. Rodriguez realized with growing horror that she was now the only thing standing between her team and complete annihilation. The seventh bullet shattered her left wrist as she raised her rifle to engage 3 insurgents climbing over the courtyard's rear wall. Rodriguez switched to her sidearm, firing with her right hand while using her damaged left arm to steady her aim. The 8th and 9th bullets hit her in quick succession, one grazing her skull and leaving a bloody furrow through her hair, another punching through her left shoulder. Rodriguez could feel her strength ebbing away with each heartbeat that pumped blood from her wounds. Her vision was beginning to blur, and her movements were becoming sluggish. But every time she considered giving up, she looked at Thompson's unconscious form and Chen's still body, and found new reserves of determination she never knew existed. The 10th bullet caught her in the abdomen as she dove to avoid a grenade blast. The explosion deafened her temporarily and filled the air with choking dust, but Rodriguez kept fighting. She had lost count of how many insurgents she had engaged, how many rounds she had fired, how many times she had been hit. Time had become a fluid thing measured only in heartbeats and muzzle flashes. Rodriguez could hear voices speaking Arabic growing closer and more confident. The insurgents knew she was badly wounded and running low on ammunition. They were taking their time now, preparing for a final assault that would end the firefight once and for all. She checked her pistol and found only 3 rounds remaining. The 11th and 12th bullets hit her almost simultaneously as she made a desperate attempt to reach Chen's rifle. Rodriguez collapsed next to her fallen comrade, her body finally beginning to shut down from blood loss and trauma. She could barely feel the 13th bullet as it tore through her leg, and the 14th seemed almost gentle as it lodged in her back. Rodriguez lay motionless in the dirt, her breathing shallow and labored. Through her fading consciousness, she could hear footsteps approaching cautiously across the courtyard. The insurgents thought she was dead, and truthfully, she felt closer to death than life. Every breath was a monumental effort, and darkness was creeping in from the edges of her vision. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance still burned. Rodriguez forced herself to remain conscious, to keep breathing, to stay alive for just a few more minutes. The promised air support had to be close now. She could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing louder, though it might have been her imagination or the ringing in her ears. The insurgents were arguing among themselves in the courtyard, apparently debating whether to finish off the wounded or simply leave them to die. Rodriguez used every ounce of willpower to remain perfectly still, feigning death while praying that rescue would arrive before she truly crossed that threshold. As consciousness slipped away, Rodriguez's last coherent thought was a promise to herself and her fallen teammates. She would survive this nightmare no matter what it took. She would live to tell their story and ensure that their sacrifice was never forgotten. Even as 14 bullets had found their mark and her blood soaked into the Iraqi soil, she refused to give up hope. Rodriguez drifted in and out of consciousness as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Time had become meaningless, measured only by the rhythm of her labored breathing and the gradual cooling of her blood-soaked uniform. The insurgents had eventually departed, convinced that all the Americans in the courtyard were dead or dying. They had taken weapons and equipment but left the bodies, planning to return under cover of darkness. The promised air support had arrived hours earlier, but the pilots could not locate the convoy's exact position among the maze of destroyed buildings and debris-filled streets. Rodriguez had heard the helicopters circling overhead, their rotor wash stirring dust through the courtyard, but she lacked the strength to signal her location. The aircraft eventually departed to refuel and regroup, leaving an eerie silence broken only by distant explosions from other parts of the city. As darkness fell over Fallujah, Rodriguez forced herself to assess her situation with whatever clarity remained. She could no longer feel her legs, and her left arm hung useless at her side. Blood had formed a sticky puddle beneath her body, and she knew that without immediate medical attention, she would not survive the night. Thompson's breathing had become irregular, and Chen remained motionless against the wall. Rodriguez tried to remember her survival training, the countless hours spent learning how to endure capture and torture. But nothing had prepared her for this slow slide toward death in an abandoned courtyard thousands of miles from home. She thought about her mother in San Antonio. Who would be setting the table for dinner about now, unaware that her daughter was bleeding out in a foreign land? The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and Rodriguez began to shiver uncontrollably. The loss of blood had made it impossible for her body to maintain its core temperature, and hypothermia was becoming as dangerous as her wounds. She tried to drag herself closer to Thompson, hoping to share what little body heat remained between them, but the effort sent waves of agony through her damaged torso. Strange hallucinations began to creep into Rodriguez's consciousness as her brain struggled with oxygen deprivation. She imagined she could hear her grandfather's voice telling her stories of his own war, of survival against impossible odds, of the strength that comes from refusing to surrender. The old man had died when she was 12, but his lessons about courage and perseverance had shaped her decision to join the army. Rodriguez forced herself to stay awake by reciting everything she could remember about her unit, her mission, her life before the war. She spoke the names of her teammates aloud, as if saying them could somehow keep their spirits alive in this place of death. She talked about Texas barbecue, her favorite songs, the movies she wanted to see when she got home, anything to keep her mind focused and her heart beating. The sound of voices in the distance snapped Rodriguez back to full alertness. Someone was moving through the rubble-strewn streets, speaking in Arabic and shining flashlights into abandoned buildings. She realized with growing dread that the insurgents were conducting a systematic search of the area, probably looking for any Americans who might have survived the ambush. Rodriguez tried to reach the pistol that had fallen from her hand hours earlier, but her fingers would not respond to her commands. She was completely helpless, unable to fight or flee, trapped in her own failing body while enemies closed in around her position. The beam of a flashlight swept across the courtyard entrance, and she held her breath as footsteps approached their hiding place. The searchers passed by without entering the courtyard, apparently satisfied that the area had already been cleared. Rodriguez exhaled slowly, grateful for this temporary reprieve but knowing that others would follow. The insurgents controlled this part of Fallujah completely, and they would eventually discover any survivors who remained hidden in the ruins. As the second night of her ordeal began, Rodriguez made a solemn promise to herself. She would not die quietly in this forgotten corner of a foreign war. If rescue came, she would be ready to help her teammates and fight her way home. If death came instead, she would meet it with dignity and courage as her grandfather had taught her. Rodriguez closed her eyes and listened to the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the empty streets. Somewhere out there, other soldiers were fighting the same battle she had fought, facing the same fears and challenges that had brought her to this moment. She drew strength from that knowledge, from the bond that connected all warriors who had ever stood between evil and the innocent. Dawn of the third day brought no relief to Rodriguez's deteriorating condition. Her wounds had become infected, and fever burned through her body like fire. She could no longer distinguish between reality and the vivid hallucinations that plagued her consciousness. Sometimes she thought she was back home in Texas, sitting on her mother's porch watching the sunrise. Other times she believed she was still in the firefight, calling out warnings to teammates who could no longer hear her. The infection spreading through Rodriguez's bloodstream should have killed her by now, according to every medical textbook ever written. But something deeper than biology kept her heart beating and her lungs drawing breath. Perhaps it was pure stubbornness, or maybe the promise she had made to survive and tell their story. Whatever force sustained her was growing weaker with each passing hour. Miles away, Navy SEAL Team 6 was preparing for a high-risk rescue operation based on fragmentary intelligence about possible survivors from the convoy ambush. The team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, had been tracking insurgent communications and movement patterns in the area where Rodriguez's unit had disappeared. Something about the enemy's behavior suggested they were guarding a secret, possibly American prisoners or bodies they wanted to exploit for propaganda purposes. Morrison's team had been operating in Fallujah for 2 months, conducting precision raids against high-value targets and gathering intelligence on insurgent networks. They were experienced urban warfare specialists who knew the city's layout better than most locals. But searching for survivors in a hostile zone, controlled by enemy, forces would test even their elite skills and training. The SEAL team inserted into the area before dawn using small boats to navigate the Euphrates River that bordered the eastern edge of Fallujah. They moved silently through the maze of damaged buildings and debris-filled streets, using night vision equipment to avoid insurgent patrols. Morrison had divided his 12-man team into 3 4-man elements, each assigned to search a different sector where the convoy might have been ambushed. Rodriguez heard the helicopters return on the morning of the 3rd day, circling in a different pattern than before. These aircraft were flying lower and more aggressively, as if their crews were actively hunting for something specific. The sound triggered a spark of hope in her failing consciousness, but she lacked the strength to signal her location, even if the pilots could see through the courtyard walls. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson was the first SEAL to spot evidence of the convoy ambush. He found burned vehicle parts and spent ammunition casings scattered across a street intersection, 3 blocks from Rodriguez's position. The debris pattern and blast damage told the story of a coordinated attack that had overwhelmed the American vehicles quickly and efficiently. Thompson radioed his discovery to Morrison, who immediately redirected both search elements toward the ambush site. The SEALs moved carefully through the area, knowing that insurgents might have booby-trapped the wreckage or posted observers to watch for rescue attempts. Every shadow could conceal an enemy sniper, and every doorway might hide an explosive device waiting to claim more American lives. Rodriguez's fevered mind began to process new sounds filtering through the courtyard walls. Boots moving with tactical precision, hand signals being passed between unseen figures, the careful manipulation of equipment by professionals who understood urban warfare. These were not the sounds made by insurgents searching for loot or bodies. Someone else was hunting in the ruins of Fallujah. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell discovered the first evidence that Americans had taken shelter in the area. She found bloody bandages and empty ammunition magazines discarded near a damaged wall, along with fragments of U.S. military uniforms. The blood was old but not ancient, suggesting that wounded soldiers had passed through this location within the past few days. Mitchell's keen eye spotted something else that made her heart race. Drag marks in the dirt leading from the street toward a cluster of buildings that included the courtyard, where Rodriguez lay dying. Someone had been wounded severely enough to leave a blood trail, but had managed to reach cover before succumbing to their injuries. The SEALs were getting close to finding answers. Morrison gathered his team and studied the evidence they had collected. The pattern suggested that at least one American had survived the initial ambush and fought a running battle through several blocks before taking refuge somewhere in this immediate area. Time was critical now, because wounded soldiers could not survive much longer without medical attention in this hostile environment. The SEAL team began a systematic building-by-building search, moving with the silent efficiency that had made them legendary among special operations forces. They communicated through hand signals and advanced communication equipment, coordinating their movements to avoid detection by insurgent observers who might still be monitoring the area. Rodriguez stirred as the sound of approaching footsteps grew distinct from her hallucinations. Through the haze of fever and blood loss, she recognized the disciplined cadence of American military personnel conducting a tactical advance. Help was finally coming, but she wondered if it would arrive in time to save what remained of her shattered team. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell was the first to peer through the gap in the courtyard fence that had saved Rodriguez's life 3 days earlier. What she saw stopped her cold. 3 American soldiers lay motionless in pools of dried blood, their uniforms shredded by gunfire and their weapons scattered around them. To any casual observer, this was clearly a scene of death and defeat. But Mitchell's trained eye caught something that made her signal urgently to her teammates. One of the bodies, a female soldier lying near the far wall, had her chest rising and falling in an almost imperceptible rhythm. After 72 hours in hell, against all medical possibility and military odds, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was still breathing. Morrison squeezed through the fence opening and approached Rodriguez carefully, mindful that insurgents sometimes booby-trapped bodies to kill rescue teams. As he knelt beside her, Rodriguez's eyes fluttered open and focused on his face with startling clarity. Despite her condition, she immediately tried to report on her unit's status and the tactical situation, her voice barely a whisper but her mind still sharp with military discipline. Rodriguez's survival defied every law of medicine and probability that Morrison had ever studied. She had 14 bullet wounds, massive blood loss, infection, hypothermia, and dehydration. By all rights, she should have died within hours of the initial attack. Yet somehow, through sheer force of will and an inexplicable biological miracle, she had endured 3 days of agony and emerged with her consciousness intact. The SEAL medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chen, immediately began emergency treatment while the rest of the team secured the perimeter. Rodriguez's vital signs were so weak they were almost undetectable, her blood pressure barely sufficient to sustain life. Chen had seen many wounded warriors during his deployments, but nothing had prepared him for someone in Rodriguez's condition who remained conscious and coherent. Rodriguez insisted on providing a complete after-action report even as the SEALs prepared her for medical evacuation. She described the ambush in tactical detail, identified the weapons and positions used by insurgents, and provided intelligence that would help prevent future attacks. Her dedication to mission accomplishment remained absolute, despite her physical devastation. Thompson and Chen, Rodriguez's teammates, had not been as fortunate. Thompson had died from his head wound during the second night, and Chen had succumbed to blood loss shortly after Rodriguez lost consciousness on the first day. The fact that Rodriguez had survived alone in that courtyard for over 48 hours, wounded and surrounded by the bodies of her friends, added another layer of tragedy and triumph to her incredible story. Morrison's team called for immediate medical evacuation while continuing to treat Rodriguez's wounds. The nearest helicopter landing zone was 6 blocks away through streets that might still contain insurgent forces. The SEALs would have to carry Rodriguez through potentially hostile territory, while she remained in critical condition, a challenge that tested their tactical skills and physical endurance. The extraction became a race against time, as Rodriguez's condition began to deteriorate rapidly once medical intervention began. Her body had somehow adapted to survive in its damaged state, but now that survival mechanisms were breaking down as normal medical procedures restored circulation to damaged tissues. Paradoxically, being rescued was threatening to kill her. Rodriguez slipped into unconsciousness as the SEAL team carried her through the rubble-strewn streets of Fallujah. Her survival had required such an enormous expenditure of willpower and physical resources that her body was finally surrendering to the inevitable. Morrison wondered if they had found her only to watch her die in their arms during the final moments of rescue. The helicopter evacuation to the trauma center at Balad Air Base took only 20 minutes, but Rodriguez flatlined twice during the flight. Each time, the flight medics managed to restart her heart and stabilize her vital signs long enough to continue the journey. Her survival had become a team effort involving dozens of military personnel who refused to let her die after she had fought so hard to live. Rodriguez spent the next 4 months recovering in military hospitals, undergoing dozens of surgeries to repair the damage from her wounds. Doctors called her recovery miraculous, though she insisted that survival was simply a matter of refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. She credited her grandfather's stories, her military training, and her determination to honor her fallen teammates for giving her the strength to endure. Years later, Rodriguez would receive the Silver Star for her actions during the ambush and her protection of wounded soldiers under impossible circumstances. But the medal that meant the most to her was a simple coin given by Lieutenant Commander Morrison, engraved with the SEAL motto, "The only easy day was yesterday." It reminded her that survival is not about avoiding hardship, but about finding the courage to face each new challenge with determination and hope. Rodriguez returned to active duty after her recovery and served 2 more deployments before retiring from the Army. She now works with veteran organizations, helping other wounded warriors find their own path to healing and purpose. Her story has become legendary among military personnel, proof that the human spirit can triumph over circumstances that seem insurmountable when courage and determination refuse to surrender.